Good morning, I'm Adam Sexton. After a whole lot of wrangling, a multi-billion-dollar foreign aid package is out the door and on its way to Ukraine, Israel, and the Indo-Pacific. Senator Jeanne Shaheen was working to make that deal happen for months, and she joins us this morning for an interview to discuss that and what happens next. Thanks for being here, Senator.
Well, I'm delighted that the package finally got done because it's critical to Ukraine and it's critical to send a message to both our allies and our adversaries that the United States can be counted on, that when we make a commitment, we live up to that commitment. I just came back from the Indo-Pacific about a month ago, and what we heard everywhere we went was concern about what's happening in Ukraine and a recognition that China, President Xi, was watching what the United States did on Ukraine. So that's very important, but it's also important because it's got priorities for the United States in there. There's funding for our own defense industrial base, which is so critical because as we've given weapons to Ukraine, we have to replace those weapons. So it's important here in New Hampshire, where we have a lot of companies like BAE that are providing significant weapons to help with this war. But also it helps the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. There's significant funding in there for the our naval operations. So it's helpful in a lot of ways.
And the last few times you've been on here, you've clearly articulated why you believe it's important for America to help Ukraine in its war against Russian aggression. But, you know, at a certain point, something has to happen. So what do you see as the end game in Ukraine?
Well, as we say, we're supporting Ukraine. Ukraine has to decide what the end game is for Ukraine. And hopefully these weapons, both in terms of the numbers, the munitions, but also some of the weapons that will have longer range ability to go after the Russians, will be important in helping them both maintain their lines and keep the Russians from breaking through.
And you mentioned sort of the different connections that are here. Obviously, the United States and Western allies are backing Ukraine. Russia has on its side China, Iran, even I think North Korea is helping it out with some weapon systems now. Are we in the early stages of another big global conflict, potentially a World War III, and we just don't see it yet because we aren't at that state?
Well, I hope not. I mean, that's part of what the deterrents are. That's part of why it's very important for us to support Ukraine in this effort against Russia. So it sends a strong message both to Russia, but also to China, to Iran, to North Korea, that we're going to stand by our allies, and when we make a commitment, we're going to follow up on that commitment. On my trip to the Indo-Pacific, one of the things that we're working very hard there is to develop our allies in the Indo-Pacific who can stand with us and be a deterrent against China. And what we heard from President Marcos in the Philippines, from President Yoon in South Korea, was a commitment to stand with the United States against the Chinese threat to the South China Sea, to the freedom of navigation that's so important to all of those countries in the Indo-Pacific.
What about Taiwan? Obviously, that's the central issue there. Is there a sense of when China may try to do something to reclaim the territory that it believes belongs to itself?
Well, there have been a number of estimates about what that date might be, but right now what we know is that President Xi is the only person who can determine that. And that's why it is important for us to have relationships and allies there. That's part of why this agreement with Australia and the United Kingdom, called AUKUS for submarine technology, is so important, so that the more we can build what we heard when we were in the Indo-Pacific was a lattice work that has all of countries, like-minded countries, connected in ways that send a strong message to China that they are not going to be free to do anything they want in that region and in the South China Sea.
In Israel, is it your opinion that Prime Minister Netanyahu is still engaging in a reasonable, proportionate response to the 10/7 terror attacks?
I don't believe that Netanyahu is doing that. I think the policy of the United States is that we do not want to see him go into Rafah. We have 1.5 million Palestinians who are there with no place to go. There would be even more devastating losses for Palestinians, mostly women and children, who are affected, and that's not acceptable.
Do you think or agree with some people who say that Israel is behaving in a genocidal manner right now?
You know, I think Israel is responding to an attack on its homeland from October the 7th. That was a terrorist attack, killed more Israelis in the country than anything since the Holocaust. Just horrific. I saw some of that raw video footage taken by Hamas of the killing, raping of women, sexual violence. Just totally unacceptable. And Israel had a right to defend itself, and I think that was appropriate, and they need to continue to be able to defend themselves against a terrorist organization, which is what Hamas is.
So where do you draw the line, though? When did they cross this line for you that they are no longer engaging in a proportionate response to that attack?
Well, I am concerned about the continued bombings in Gaza, about the blocking of humanitarian assistance that has opened up more in the last few weeks in ways that are very important to make sure that we don't see the widespread famine that we're worried is coming in Gaza. But we've got to continue to push Netanyahu, and his own people are pushing him. As we've seen, there have been mass demonstrations in Israel to urge him to get an agreement around releasing the remaining hostages, which is part of the negotiations right now that would involve a ceasefire. So I think that's very important, and we need to continue the pressure in the United States to urge that to happen.
Should America, and specifically the Biden administration, be more vocal about those hostages? Particularly, I believe 8 Americans, 5 living, 3 dead was the last number I saw, still there.
I think we have been vocal. I met with a number of the hostage families last week, and they had told me they had a very good meeting at the White House with the Vice President and appreciated all of the support from the United States to continue to pressure both Prime Minister Netanyahu and Hamas to release the remaining hostages.
Is a two-state solution still possible in this environment?
I think the only answer has to be a separate Palestinian state. I mean, the fact that we are where we are today is because that has not happened yet. No, I remember the negotiations that President Clinton led with Yasser Arafat and Israeli officials, where they had an agreement that Arafat walked away from that would have gotten them to a separate Palestinian state. And that long-term has to be the answer.
Speaking of proportionate response, we are seeing campus unrest here in New Hampshire, people protesting the war in Israel. In New Hampshire specifically, do you think state officials and universities acted appropriately in really being aggressive to stop the encampments from gaining a foothold here on campus this year?
I support peaceful protest, peaceful demonstration. I think there is no room for hate speech, for anti-Semitism, or for Islamophobia, for that matter. And for students and non-students violating the law on campus. And so, fortunately, when police moved in Hanover and at UNH, it was mostly peaceful. There were no major injuries that we've heard so far. But what we have heard is that there were outside agitators who were involved. Both police chiefs from Durham and from Hanover have said that they saw that on those campuses. And what we know is that our adversaries, China and Russia, are taking advantage of divisions in the United States and trying to exploit those to urge more unrest, more violence, and that is unacceptable, and we need to take action against that immediately.
The governor said that he believes that these protests are being driven by, quote, 100% pure anti-Semitism. Do you agree with that sentiment?
Well, certainly anti-Semitism has been part of that, but again, free speech is important. It's a bedrock of our Constitution. But hopefully we would do it in a way that's respectful, that listens to other people's opinion. And free speech, I don't think, means that hate speech is okay. And whether that hate is directed against Jews or Muslims or whoever, that should not be acceptable. And I hope that college campuses and professors will look at this with students as an opportunity to talk about some of those differences, to talk about how we bridge those differences and how we figure out a way to move forward. Because divisions, violence, hatred is not the answer.
Yeah, and you were in your 20s at the peak of the Vietnam War protests in the United States, and I think it's actually going to be the 54th anniversary of Kent State this weekend.
Right.
Vietnam War, very different conflict, different set of circumstances, both here and abroad. One common thread I think you see, though, is that you see older generations then and now kind of scratching their heads at the idea that these young people might be making some kind of common cause with the enemy. Having been on both sides of that generational divide now, does it change at all the way you felt about people in authority back then, say your U.S. senators then, or does it change how you see these youth today who have far less at stake, admittedly, than your generation did in the Vietnam era?
Well, I understand the passion that young people feel, and I think that's good. We want young people to be engaged. We want them to be engaged in what's happening in the world, because it matters to all of us how these issues are decided and what that means for us here at home. But again, we need to think about how we do it in a way that's respectful, that's peaceful. I was one of those demonstrators on my campus, not against the Vietnam War, but in favor of students' rights. And we were able to resolve those issues because we were able to sit down with people in authority and talk about what was going to be acceptable and what we wanted to see happen. So that has to be a piece of what we see. It can't just be standing on opposite sides and yelling at each other. We've got to figure out a way to move forward.
All right, Senator, don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more from Senator Shaheen, including how she would approach a second Trump administration. Stay with us.